Excited about this topic, but let's go. Before we dive into today's exciting interview, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Books to Life Marketing, the team making it all possible. They specialize in helping authors bring their stories through life through expert publishing, marketing, and media exposure. They're behind some of the most inspiring authors' journeys we've seen. If you're an author looking to elevate your book, Books to Life Marketing is the partner in your corner. And our guest today is Amy Twilegar. Amy, thanks for coming by, and your book's titled Psychology. Thanks for coming on again and coming on the show. I appreciate it. We were talking in the back room about ADHD. And so the book is a research compilation addressing diagnostic criteria measures in the assessment of adult ADHD. The significance within emergent properties have late onset, and thus highlights the need for revision when it comes to child abuse. All right, you are a postgraduate student whose extensive research on the development of ADHD and adulthood has shed new light on confounding variables that should be considered in a diagnosis. Thanks for coming by. I love this, to dive deeper into this, but what inspired you, first of all, to write this book?
I've done a lot of research on adult ADHD, particularly because I found a missing link when it comes to diagnosing adults. It's traditionally thought of as a childhood disorder, and often it is, but there's also some factors that are overlooked that should be included in the diagnostic criteria manual and should be changed for assessing adult ADHD.
Okay, and see, that's interesting how that assessment comes on to pass. What is the take-home message you hope to get across to readers?
The criteria needs to be changed. There's so many factors that play into the development of adult ADHD, and the late onset of symptoms are rarely regarded, if not dismissed or misdiagnosed. And there's precursor variables such as anxiety, and the DSM currently states that it must be a childhood disorder prior to 12 years of age, and it must not be comorbid with anxiety disorder. And I refute both of those claims.
Can I jump in right that point? Because this is more of a conversation than giving away the whole book, but everyone needs to read it. Here's my take. When you deal with getting PTSD, you get complex PTSD, or you get anxiety disorder or different things, your attention's going down quick. You're not going to be able to pay attention to things. Concussion syndrome as well. People who've been multiple concussions, those different things. Yes, you've lost the ability to pay attention in so many aspects. Too much stress in your life, and bipolar disorder, or all these different things really can make you not have attention deficit disorder now.
Absolutely. And plus developmental factors such as growing up with abuse, growing up with fear, for instance, primes the brain. It becomes conditioned to have emotional instability, so to speak. And that emotional instability, dysregulation patterns that are learned from the early years are going to definitely affect your attention, because you can't think clearly when you're emotionally aroused, and when you can't cognitively control your attentional shifts. It's likely due to, if you were abused as a child, that is, it goes into a thought disorder. And if you experience those occurrences later on in life, it comes back threefold, as the research poses. And that's at a critical phase of development in adulthood, 20 to 24 years of age. And you're in trouble, because at that point, your brain's crystallizing in those dendritic connections for forming your emotional regulation, self-regulation patterns in this dysregulation.
See, I've never heard this before. And it's through my own experiences working with people as a marketing coach and owning an agency and working with people and seeing certain stressors, and as a teacher in the classroom, where we want to label them one diagnosis, when ultimately, if we knew that it had this modality as well, we're going to have better treatment for the disorder than literally just going and focusing on one area, which will be fixed potentially or changed through therapy. But if we don't add that other, it's going to be a really hard road to hoe, especially when you talk about ADHD.
I agree completely, because by the time you're an adult, that criteria says you cannot receive the diagnosis if it was not there in childhood. And if you grew up in fear, you're going to have hypervigilance, looking over your shoulder constantly and scared. And those patterns are lifelong if they continue into adulthood.
100%. No, I totally do. And why do you think there's challenges you faced in getting the word out of the change that's needed? Who's stopping you from by bringing out these specific situations?
Well, it's commonly known to be a childhood disorder, but without taking into context the brain mechanisms, the brain pathways that are interrupted in the neurotransmitters, in experiencing these early abusive home environments from the parental caregiver relationship, it's not accepted just yet that it can be, they accept that adult ADHD can occur as a late onset of symptoms, but they say that either it went unnoticed or undetected is what they say, or if they're just not adjusting right to college life, for instance, in those young adulthood years. But that's not always the case. That's not always the whole story when you grew up with child abuse, because that primes your brain to have this emotional reactivity pattern that is maladaptive in coping in the later years. And it can develop in adulthood. And anxiety is absolutely a comorbid aspect.
And child abuse is an interesting one too, with the percentage of kids that were abused as a child, and then it comes back through our subconscious. And that is the thing that, but honestly, I think there's so many different ways we can treat ADHD, and we can treat any type of disability or disorder. We can treat it based on the root causes and looking at it in multiple modalities. So that's where the niche specialist that only focuses on ADHD won't work, because you have to look at having other specialties and understanding these things and getting doctors and therapists to learn other areas, because we're not one size fits all looking at a diagnosis, right?
The problem is you don't receive the diagnosis, you're not going to receive the proper treatment that you need. And so therefore you're going to either get misdiagnosed having depression, but of course they would become depressed if they're so relentless trying to get the help that they need, and they are either dismissed or receive therapy alone. If you grow up in fear as a scared child with child abuse, you're independent and you don't have a voice then. But when you finally receive your own voice as a young adult, and you finally realize that you've got a problem with concentration, restlessness, fidgeting, anxiety, definitely anxiety. Yeah. It's like you can't get the treatment that they'll give you antidepressants, but that works on a different network in the brain. And that's how are you going to compare the two? Depression's a mood disorder, but it's a thought disorder. And you can see in brain scans where the metabolic pathways in the brain are affected when they have stress-induced conditions in laboratory setting. So the fMRI scans are definitely a supplemental thing that should be included. They need to change the books. I
already can see, but they need to change the books and how we deal with health altogether.
Absolutely.
Really. And because if you don't treat the brain, your body's going to react later in life too. So if you have multiple problems in the brain that need to be addressed, that's going to lead to lots of problems in the body, which is going to lead to more and more medications, and which is going to lead to more and more a spiral down the wrong path. And then what's happening is the people that are not educated that are missing out the most, because they're trusting their doctors. And after they read your book, what would you say to somebody that's going to challenge one of their doctors? I already am thinking of somebody to talk about based on this interview and share that with that person and challenge. How can we challenge so that they do get on an ADHD medically, or a medication that treats both anxiety and ADHD?
Present them with my book, and I hope that the word spreads like wildfire.
And what, have you gotten any arguments or conversations with people about it, or it's more about once they've read it, they understand it, and they say, okay, now we have to make these changes?
I have gotten one opposition so far, and that was when somebody was talking about PTSD and they were talking about trauma, but they were talking about a very acute stressor. Now we're talking prolonged stressor, the corticosteroids and the stress hormones, cortisol, hitting the adrenal glands in your bloodstream. You have that long-term stress response, and your brain becomes hardwired according to such. And so therefore, developmental aspect is huge. It has to be taken into account, because the case history reports, anybody can come in and say I have a history of child abuse and it's affecting the way that they're thinking. But those brain scans, as the clinical psychologists, they can say, let's take a look at those brain scans and then we can go from there. But looping back around to the PTSD, the acute stressors aren't going to make you vulnerable as a high risk for ADHD development in adulthood, because it was transient and you get over it. But when you can't do anything about it, that sense of learned helplessness goes to sense of learned hopelessness, your anxiety, your angst, and you eventually just give up and say, why bother?
Exactly.
And it's like that with the treatment protocol now today as well, because of course you're going to become depressed, can't get the help they need, because those antidepressants are not going to work on somebody with specific ADHD in adulthood that has grown up with child abuse. It's a different part of the brain that's activated.
So even the antidepressants won't work because of that fact?
No, it would have to be
it could have difficulty treating even that because of what they've gone through in childhood. You're opening up a can of worms in a way, because then you would address, are we giving them the right antidepressant medications? Or
Right.
is it masking antidepressant because they can't pay attention and they make decisions in their lives? We all know people, adults with ADHD, struggle with many tasks that could lead to misdiagnosis completely based.
So for some people, antidepressants will work, but they typically are more geared towards like the mesolimbic system. For amygdala, you can't stop the sad thoughts. And so when you can't stop sad thoughts, you're really working on a different thought disorder problem, as opposed to when you're physically abused as a child and you go up in fear and you have that primed reactive response in the developing brain, it becomes a pattern behavioral that you're really at a disadvantage if you're one of those small set of population that grew up with child abuse, because it's not well recognized. And a lot of times it is depression, and it can help with depression, but sometimes that's not the whole story.
All right, so let's talk about complex PTSD. I was, again, because I've been using them, I remember the product now. Shout out to the Mendy. And what a great for brain training. There was a training on the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD. Comes out later in life based on one tragic event from a long time ago as a child. That complex PTSD, if continued occurs, is a totally different thing. And that's going to definitely hurt your attention, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It messes with your thought patterns, and everyone's different. So some antidepressants might work, but hopefully if they don't integrate this brain scans and have a cross reference between the case history reports and the evidence where you're raised, they better get something that works more.
I think everyone should be doing this. I think everyone should be doing brain scans. I think everyone should be doing what I talked about, the Mendy. I think you were surprised to know me using it, and I'm a big advocate already on that. But also when I was talking about brain scans with you off air, I won't say why, but ultimately I'm looking at, because of, as an entrepreneur, I want my body to be on an optimal level. We are going to live a lot longer lives. Our lifespan for people in their 50s is probably going to be 100, 110. And we're looking at retirement. We're looking at, at one point we can relax. If we don't allow our brains, we're going to get Alzheimer's, dementia, and we're going to die very quickly unless we work on improving our brain is so important. And I'm glad you're addressing this in this book, but I think in underlying wise, you want people all to improve their brains and look at things, because our brain is what's going to keep us living a happy, healthy life.
Yep. Your quality of life is really what's going to be affected if you can't get the proper treatment that you need.
And what do you see people who have adults ADHD? What's their lifespan? They've never done that research. Like, what are we seeing lifespan wise for them? If
there's not a significant correlation enough to validly say this, but I have read in some studies that they do have a higher mortality rate. They die earlier because their quality of life isn't up to par, and they give up hope, for instance, and all that can really affect your lifespan. Absolutely.
So I want to bring up Temple Grandin, but I have so many more questions for you. Let's go. I'm, again, a former special education advocate. I don't think you knew that about me, maybe unless you did your research.
Yeah.
So I'm a former teacher. I have a master's degree in education, and I was an educational advocate representing mostly autistic kids with IEPs and ADHD, and I'm going into the schools and advocating for them years ago. But what I've learned in that process, when we talk about Temple Grandin, is I also was a BSc and a TSS before too, and a developmental therapist. So working with the autism community, I learned about Temple Grandin. What is the reason that I see that question, Temple Grandin? Let's go into that.
Oh my gosh. I admire her so much. I can't tell you how many times I've watched her movie. She went against all odds, and she had a revolutionary idea as well, and she spoke up about it. What's interesting to me is that when they looked at her college notebooks, it was full of pictures. There was not one word, from what I understand. But she had a newfound idea, perspective, and I really look up to her because she's like my hero. Admired her for a long time, following her work, and she went and did it, and I'm proud of her.
So was there any relationship to ADHD and autism and from Temple Grandin, or is that a goal for you to break it in with your studies and stuff to say you want to be that next revolutionary person?
Absolutely. Anxiety is an underlying symptomatology among a lot of mental disorders, and definitely with autism. And that's why they have behavioral stereotypies, is what they call them, where they clap a lot or they pound on something and they don't make eye contact. That's anxiety. That tactile stimulation is what keeps them. Actually, as a matter of fact, she mentions that in her movie too, that she had a little doll that she would just go and hug, and it reminded her of what a mother what it would feel like to have a nurturing mother And she said, it's not as good, but at least it's something. And the anxiety is terrible with autism.
It's terrible. And why we don't have different levels of autism. We got rid of that. That was terrible. We're Asperger's. Once we got rid of the Asperger's diagnosis and we added all to under an autism umbrella was a mistake. Because ultimately, you can't treat one autistic child differently than another. They're so different in a variety of levels. We should have come up with something better. Because I think we're missing out a lot of brilliant people with autism. They're all brilliant, but meaning brilliant that we have given a Band-Aid to not be able to go to its overall brilliance that could happen.
That's because there's a social stigmatism also when it comes to mental disorders. And we try to avoid that as a topic and people. And it shouldn't be that way. We should really pay more attention, no pun intended, to individual variation and what led up to the triggering of that gene to be turned on and what really started the whole process there, because that makes a difference. History is important.
Well, this is a powerful interview, and I'm definitely going to encourage all my listeners and viewers to share this like crazy, because this is different. This is, I think, the reason why you wanted to come on a platform like my platform, is that you saw that this is something no one else is talking about. Your profession, are you working, do you do brain scans? Is that what you do? Or no? What is your profession?
I am actually striving to get my PhD and go further with all this. And I really can't go too far without attaining that. And I want to be a college professor and speak to the masses and get the word like this out, because there's always revisions that can be made to things like criteria for mental disorders, for instance. There's always something that you can improve on. And for individuals, everyone's different.
What are your next steps for your PhD? What's happening now?
This is one of them, to get the word out, because it is a newfound idea and perspective that is often either overlooked, dismissed, or disregarded, or like you said, the misdiagnoses. It's something needs to change.
There's going to have to be a healthcare revolution. And even though, regardless of what you think of Kennedy, what he's done, he's ultimately, there's people that like it, against, or not. He at least was trying to make this revolution happen. What we need to look at is ultimately at the end of the day, if we allow our doctors to make the decisions for us, we're going to lose. It's up to us, especially using artificial intelligence now, to become advocates of ourselves, to ask questions, and to get as much research as possible before making your decision, because it's your health, not somebody else's. And if a doctor tells you, sorry about it, nope, we ain't going to do it, go find another doctor. That's what you have to do. You might have to go multiple. And if you bring research to the table, that's a key. So is your book full of certain research you've developed that you've put together? Give us
It's all research, actually. So the research compilation is to back up what I'm saying, and because you can't refute science. So
no, you can't.
It's meta-analytical in the sense that I compile a bunch of research studies that all contribute, and you put it all together like web, and you not only see the consistency and the pattern of things, conventional labeling, for instance, of mental disorders, but you also see the problem in things and where it veers off and what can be improved upon. And that's just something that needs to be brought to attention. But in order to do that, it's going to be quite difficult, because it's going to require a paradigm shift, and translational gap is what that means is converging psychology and psychiatry. And that's going to be a big challenge, a big feat, but it must be done. And somebody had to get the ball rolling in terms of why and how. And
I would take this interview. I would share this with talk to your team, share this with every professor involved in this stuff, and see who's going to make that movement. And I'm rooting for you to get into a PhD program, because I think you really have something that makes sense. I've not read the book to get to see the research on it, but it all makes sense based on observational research that I have dealt with. Being around people that have potentially anxiety that's led to ADHD. Why? Because I have it. I know what ADHD is. I can spot it like a heartbeat. And then I have this gift that I figured it out. I don't know how. I was able to figure it out so I can produce 20 times faster than many humans. I wouldn't say AI, but I can do that. And I'm like, now I'm learning other people's learning styles. I wish as a teacher, I really discovered that further. Now, later on, after interviewing 20,000 plus people, I've discovered it. So I love your groundbreaking research. Where is the best place people can go and buy the book?
all major retailers, Books to Life Marketing, my website as well, author amytwilegar.com. And I have another one at translational developmental psychobiology.com. That should be on the first website as well. Barnes & Noble, Amazon.com.
I'm rooting for you. All right. You're listening and watching The Neil Haley Show, and we'll be back.